Taking these factors from actual scientific research may reshape the way you think about your bass fishing this season, especially when it comes to late summer bass fishing, so make sure you stay tuned for that one. Now, all the information in this video is not just me randomly coming up with stuff, it's actual scientific research that comes from Dr. Keith Jones' book, Knowing Bass, the Scientific Approach to Catching More Fish. Well, what I am most interested in here is how much bass can learn, and what exactly does it mean to learn? Well, Dr. Jones breaks down types of learning into 3 specific categories, so I will go over those and give you specific examples for each. But before we get into that, there's a couple things I want to cover, and I found this quote from the book very interesting. The process of learning has nothing to do with intelligence. Learning is a natural outcome of all nervous systems, a byproduct of the way nerve cells work. Well, if we think about our own learning and the learning of other animals like our pets in our lives, this is a statement that really fits well with that. For an example, we can be pretty young as humans, and if we get our hand near the hot flame of a candle, we learn because of that stimulus that's not something we want to do again. Now, if we keep this in mind, these next scenarios are going to make perfect sense. It's also important to note that in this research, it was documented that within the species, some bass can learn very quickly, while others don't, leading to some bass being caught again and again and again. In fact, the variation between how bass learn from one fish to another can vary so greatly that in a 4-year study, now this is an exact excerpt right from the book, in one 4-year study of angling recapture rates at a catch and release lake in Illinois, the average largemouth was caught twice each season. However, some bass were caught up to 16 times in a single season. And it is because of this that Texas Parks and Wildlife actually considered for a while, or toyed around with the idea of creating a genetic race of bass that did not learn as quickly and were easier to catch. And there's a lot of days I wish that that program came to fruition. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and jump right into the 3 ways that bass can learn. The first type of learning that was mentioned is associative learning. And this type of learning happens when an animal links 2 types of stimuli. Probably most of you have heard about the famous Pavlov's dog experiment, where a dog starts to salivate when it hears a bell ring. So when a very specific bell was rung, the dog in this study would associate that with getting fed and would start to salivate. It took 2 stimulus, the bell and then the feeding or the food, and linked those stimulus together, associated them together. Now, the example that Dr. Keith Jones gives in his book talks about rattling crankbaits. So the more a bass is exposed to the rattling acoustic signature, the more the fish is likely to imprint with that sound. And we're going to talk about the inner ear of the bass and a lateral line in later videos, but it's important to keep in mind that the more they hear that rattle, the more they are being imprinted with that particular sound. And if a bass eventually decides to strike that lure, the shock of getting caught, the trauma of getting caught, can be associated or linked with that rattling sound. Those are 2 stimulus that the bass can associate or learn from. Now, as mentioned earlier, some bass are going to be better at this than others. The second type of learning that was mentioned in the book is habituation, and I hope that I am saying that correctly. This is where the bass, or any animal, including us, gradually becomes less sensitive to stimulus. The very first thing that popped into my mind is I grew up right next to railroad tracks. Well, after a while, I completely ignored them. I almost didn't even hear a train coming. Whereas if we had company over, they would often ask, how can you live right here? That train is so loud and annoying. So in that situation, I became less sensitive to that stimulus. Well, in the book, it talks about bass that are in huge aquariums at our favorite big box retailers. When those fish are first placed in those aquariums, they are spooked by the situation, they are not comfortable whatsoever. But after a while, they become less sensitive to that stimulus, and eventually the throngs of people coming up to the aquarium glass, pressing their faces against it, banging on the glass, the fish in there just completely ignore it, and probably a lot of you have experienced that firsthand when you go up to those aquariums. Now, how does this relate to us as anglers? Where at the beginning of the video, I talked about late summer bass fishing. Well, guess what? And in the book, this was mentioned, and I've also experienced this firsthand, is that bass can start to ignore that stimulus of boat traffic on busy lakes in summer days. Now, the beginning of the season, very different than the end of the season. And this is something that I have firsthand witnessed and experienced. Some of the best days of fishing I've ever had on my home lake have been on the busiest weekends when there is the most boat traffic, and especially where those boat wakes constantly wash up against the shoreline. I've caught a lot of fish in those situations, assuming because it's the food chain getting activated and kicked into gear. So we could also say this links back to associative learning as well, where they associate those busy weekends, that stimulus, with the food chain getting activated. Now, the last type of learning that was mentioned in the book is spatial learning. So think about home territories. We know that bass can be territorial at some sort of scale, whether that's in a smaller area or a larger area, they become territorial. And spatial learning allows them to identify structure types of elements. We all know that on our home lakes and rivers, there are certain areas that traditionally produce well. Bass like to go there when they are ready to feed. Well, without spatial learning, they would not be able to find their way back to these locations day after day or year after year. So what are some more takeaways that us as anglers can learn from this? First, it's probably safe to say that a lot of the bass that we catch are the ones that do not learn as well, especially the smaller fish. The big bass on any body of water have experience on their side. They have experienced more stimulus. They have been in more situations. They've had more chance to learn from those situations. So the first thing that pops into my mind, especially on busy weekends or busy bodies of water, is that idea we often talk about of doing something different probably is more important than most of us realize. And that doing something different not only applies to lures, throwing something that not everybody else is using, but also our actual presentation, really focusing on the presentation, how our lure looks, what it's doing. All of those factors probably make a bigger impact than we often think about. Remember, those bigger fish are good at surviving and excellent at learning from those negative and positive stimuli. And if you like these types of videos, make sure you check out my Bass Behavior Bundle, where we dive into this type of topic all the time. 3 new videos coming out just this month. And hey, if you want to watch a video that talks about rod movement, and it's actually synced video between rod movement and what our lures are doing under the water, pretty interesting what we actually captured and what you can see here. Make sure you go ahead and check this one out, and make sure that you go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.